Meeting the world's growing demand for energy while reducing our impact on the planet is one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. A challenge that demands not just innovative technologies and materials, but new ways of thinking, new business models, policies and regulations, and a new approach to energy infrastructure. At Energy Futures Lab, Imperial College London's Global Energy Institute, we bring together world-class science, engineering and policy expertise to carry out research that transcends disciplinary boundaries to find systemic solutions for a sustainable energy future. Working in partnership with industry and governments, we drive technological innovation that has real-world impact and help to shape the policy landscape through high-quality evidence and advocacy for positive change. Through our internationally unique master's degree programme and regular events and opportunities for early career researchers, we aim to inspire and enable future leaders of the energy sector. Together, we're helping to accelerate the clean energy transition and build a secure and sustainable energy future that delivers for everyone. To find out more about Energy Futures Lab, our upcoming events or energy research at Imperial College, visit our website imperial.ac.uk/Energy Futures Lab.
Hello everyone. My name is Anna Korre, Professor of Environmental Engineering at Imperial College and one of two co-directors at Energy Futures Lab. On behalf of Energy Futures Lab, I would like to welcome you to our lecture this evening, focusing on an important vision, a world that runs on green energy. We had an enormous response to this event, and we are delighted that so many of you can join us. Before we begin, a few pieces of housekeeping. This event will last an hour and a half. There will be a short break in the lecture, after which we will have a panel discussion with our speakers and a number of Imperial College wind energy experts. There will be an opportunity to submit questions during the panel session. You will find the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen. This event will last an hour and a half. The time is short, so we may only be able to address a handful of questions. So we would encourage you to read the questions already submitted and like the ones you would most like the panel to discuss. You can submit questions anonymously if you wish. Now, to speak a little bit about energy research at Imperial College and to introduce tonight's speakers, I will hand over now to the founding director of Energy Futures Lab and Dean of the Imperial College of Faculty of Engineering, Professor Nigel Brandon. Nigel.
Anna, thanks very much indeed, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone here to this really fascinating and important lecture. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, just to note, the Energy Futures Lab is one of 6 global challenge institutes that we have at the college that reach across all 4 faculties of Imperial College London. The institute was established some years ago now to address global energy challenges and aims to promote energy innovation and advanced system solutions for a sustainable energy future, bringing together the science, engineering and policy expertise across Imperial College and fostering collaboration with a wide range of external partners in industry, in government and academia. And as Anna said, the tremendous interest in tonight's lecture reflects the importance of the topic we're discussing. Wind energy is clearly critical in terms of greening the UK's electricity system and through this many other parts of our economy. At Imperial College, our offshore renewable energy network represents much of our work in this area, from wind turbine design through energy storage and hydrogen to power systems. So that's why we're so delighted to welcome this evening's speakers from the global leader in offshore wind to set out their vision for a world that runs on green energy. So if I could just briefly introduce both speakers, and then we can ask them to press on. So first introduce Duncan Clark. Duncan is Ørsted's head of region for the UK, leading the company's operations within the UK. He joined the company in 2012 as program director in offshore wind, responsible for delivering the Westernmost Rough and Hornsea 1, both record-breaking projects that paved the way for the next generation of offshore wind farms. And he took up the position of head of region in December 2019. And prior to joining Ørsted, he spent 18 years in the UK energy industry in both renewables and energy storage with npower Energy and the Crown Estate. We're also very pleased to welcome back an alumni of the college, Sophie Lewis, a senior commercial project manager for the Hornsea 3 offshore wind farm. Sophie graduated from Imperial in 2011 with an MSc in physics, began her career at Credit Suisse before she saw the light and moved into the energy sector. She took on a role as a business analyst for startup building and operating vessels used in the construction of offshore wind farms, and later worked as an investment analyst at the UK Green Investment Bank before joining Ørsted in 2017. Duncan, welcome. Sophie, welcome back. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And while Sophie presents for us, thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you for that welcome. Delighted to be here speaking tonight and delighted to be talking about something which we are so passionate about ourselves. A world that runs entirely on green energy is the company vision in Ørsted, and Nigel, you've introduced us as the world leader in offshore wind. That is where we are today, but that's not always what we've been or who we've been. So in a minute, I'll start by maybe a bit of a history lesson and how did we get here? And then I'll hand over to Sophie, who will talk a bit about how that's a tangible, how we're doing it today in terms of having a significant impact on in the UK on our journey to net zero, and then returning at the end to a bit of a step back and looking at our energy system, our electricity system as a whole, and how offshore wind is now envisaged to fit into that. So if we start with our experience, I could have started in 1991, which is when the very first offshore wind farm was constructed. But that's probably too much of a history lesson. So maybe the place to start is in 2006, when a company called Dong Energy was established by merging a number of different companies in Denmark who did various different parts of the energy system. There was Dong Energy, that was Danish oil and natural gas. So the clue is in the name there. But also there are companies there that supply electricity to consumers, that operate electricity networks, and also operate coal-fired power stations, and also district heating systems, which in Scandinavia are a big thing. And this company, Dong Energy, was owned by the Danish state, so it was a government-owned utility. And if you look back at 2006 and the profile of the heat and power production from the company, you can see that on the right-hand side of this page here. So a majority in coal, and if you add the natural gas and oil, this is actually one of Europe's most fossil-oriented energy companies. And you know, that is the starting point for our story, really. And I think the next place to pick up the story will be a few years later, when we had, you know, been actually quite a big part of a journey through the early days of an offshore wind industry, and had reached actually a different place. And at that point, I think, Sophie, if you can just introduce where we got to. Thank you.
Why have we decided that our new name should be Ørsted? Well, we need to go back to 1777 on a little Danish island called Langeland, to the birth of a boy named Hans Christian Ørsted. Before Hans Christian Ørsted was born, the world only knew about static electricity. But Ørsted was a very curious scientist. He uncovers the beginning of a technological revolution when he discovers the connection between electricity and magnetism. For a long time, something always had to be burned to produce large quantities of energy. But thanks to Ørsted, we do it slightly different today. Without his discovery, we wouldn't be able to utilize the wind to convert into green energy. But Ørsted had many more ideas. He was looking for connections, not just in science, but also in nature, philosophy, and art. Maybe inspired by conversations with his good friend, the writer Hans Christian Andersen. Imagine, Ørsted actually created 2,000 Danish words. He found patterns in sounds, and his fascination with nature paved the way for the Danish Meteorological Institute. He co-founded the Technical University of Denmark and was the first to extract aluminium. We also named one of our first power stations after him. Ørsted helped all of us build the world as we know it today. His curiosity, dedication, and great interest in nature are precisely what is required to create a world that runs entirely on green energy. That's why Ørsted is our new name.
So that's a video from 2017. And at that moment, we had refocused the company to make nearly all its investments into renewable energy, to focus its strategies on tackling what we see as the defining issue of our time, to limit global warming and halve the emissions by 2030. That means phasing out coal, phasing out fossil fuels, building out green power capacity and transitioning the whole system, electrifying things that are currently not done by electricity, and really majoring on energy efficiency as well. And also by this time, we'd gone from being 100% owned by the Danish state to having gone through a public offering. And so where we are today, where half of our shares are owned by the Danish state and the other half are owned by others and traded on the stock markets. So this is a very different company. We had sold the assets that we had previously owned that were in oil and gas. It had been those assets that had generated the cash to invest that we used to invest in things like offshore wind. And what you see here on these bars is a three-part story, and I think it starts on the very left there with the emissions. So if you take over that journey that we've talked about, an 85% reduction in the carbon intensity, if you like, of the energy that we provide to our customers. And then if you look at the next two bars, you actually see that transformation from a fossil-oriented energy company to a much cleaner one, not perfectly clean, but was also done with really great financial performance, actually a very significant improvement. And the reason why that's important is because for as long as I've been in this sector, the received wisdom has been that renewables and green power is something which, you know, requires a bit of charity, it requires a subsidy, requires special treatment, and is not something that can stand up on its own. But what we've seen in the journey of this company is that actually there are great opportunities to invest. There are incredible opportunities to grow, to innovate, and that can be done in a way which really does reward investors and is attractive in competition with other opportunities. And then on the right hand side, two other really important things. You know, in that time, going from being 88% Danish company in terms of where our assets sit, where our people are based, where our investments are, to now being 93%. This is last year, it'd be even higher today, 93% outside Denmark. So that transition, not only has it made our impact on emissions and thus climate change much, much smaller, it's made our financial performance much better, and we've been able to grow outside our home area, if you like, and grow into other markets. And then finally, on the very right-hand side, you can see that in doing so, our people, who were already quite highly satisfied, but the people who work for the company even love this new mission and this new company even more than they did before. So if we now maybe move to the next page, what we see there is a snapshot and that map on the left-hand side there of where we've got to today. So I mentioned that the very first offshore wind farm was 1991. Well, what you see there in that circle of the North Sea, the Irish Sea and the Baltic Sea is where the bulk of offshore wind farms have been installed. And you can see most of those that you can see there are ones that have been installed, and some of them are under construction and some of them are still in a state of development towards starting construction. But you can see, first of all, the UK is a real centre of this. It's the world's leading market, and also Germany, Denmark, and also the Netherlands. So on top of that, more recently, we've seen really rapid growth in North America, and you can see the eastern seaboard there in the top left. Lots of opportunities, projects coming forward through the development stages, and even some already operating. And similarly, in Asia Pacific, enormous growth potential, massive interest and excitement by countries all over the region. At the moment, it's Taiwan with the leading position and early assets and early construction projects. So that's where the activity has been. We've been fortunate enough to be able to develop and bring to fruition a number of projects. The picture you can see behind me here, that's a photograph of Hornsea 1. That's the largest offshore wind farm in the world. It's 1.2 gigawatts. It's 174 turbines out there in the North Sea, roughly level with the Humber, but way out of sight. 6 hours sailing before you can get to it. And what we see here is a journey from small nearshore wind farms of maybe 30 turbines through to where we are now, very large arrays, far from shore, much larger turbines. And really, this is offshore wind having made a transition to be there on the same terms as conventional power stations. On the right-hand side there, you can see some statistics in relation to the Ørsted footprint and track record, and this is particularly relevant. We'll need to come back to talking about gigawatts in the future, but as at this summer, our company had constructed about 7 gigawatts of capacity. And the reason I wanted you to remember that is because we'll come back to the UK's target for 2030, which was recently reinforced as being 40 gigawatts in the UK alone by 2030, and we'll come back to that and just have a thought for how challenging that's going to be. How is that done? How is that fleet of operating assets built up? And the first point, I think, is that to bring an offshore wind farm to fruition is quite a journey, and it needs a massively diverse range of skills that start with identifying seabed and maturing projects through a process of project development, stitching together land agreements, grid connection agreements, surveying and assessing seabed geology, assessing environmental impacts, consulting and getting planning permission, and then raising funding. Once you've got the funding raised, an investment decision, and then moving into construction, and then construction may take a few years, 3, 4, 5 years, depending on the complexity of the project, and then an operating life that 10 years ago we would plan for 20 years. In the last few years, people have been planning for 25 years, and going forward, people will be planning for 30 years or more for these assets. And on top of that, as is normal in energy assets, quite often the ownership interests in the assets gets traded, partnerships, and through that way we will recycle the capital so that we can utilize that capital again to build the next wind farm. What makes a difference? What makes a company successful in that? Well, being able to look at that full end-to-end life cycle. That's a long process, needs lots and lots of different skills in different technical disciplines, commercial disciplines, and planning, and to throughout that have everybody focused on, what will it take to deliver an asset at the end of the day with a cost-effective cost of that clean energy, and that design and optimization through the cycle. Secondly, actually, this is all about risk, whether that's risk in the development phase that you may be spending money on surveys but never get to bring a project to fruition, or whether it's in construction when you have dozens of different installation contracts, all of which have to work like clockwork, feeding into each other, or whether it's through the operating life where you have to make assumptions about how often you may have to take those turbines down for servicing, or how often they may fail and you may need to get someone out to them to actually get them back working again. All of those things are about risk. When you raise funding, that's all about the perception of risk. And then finally, I said it's many technical disciplines and commercial disciplines involved in doing that. The only way you can bring all of that together into a successful project is to have all of those people working together, aligning, communicating, and learning the lessons and feeding back into the next project. So that really is what it takes to succeed. It's an enormous amount of fun doing that. I've totally enjoyed my time in the industry doing this, and I can absolutely recommend it to anyone who might be thinking of it. If we go into the next page, just briefly, this is where that's got us to today. It's still a relatively young market in terms of energy, and Ørsted on the left there is the market leader in terms of the capacity that we've either managed the construction of ourselves, or that we've got under construction, or we've got in our near pipeline there. So we've got not quite a third, but almost a third of that global market experience. And that's a great place to be. I think at that point, that sort of gives you a feel for our transition. It's a transition that I think is there as an example. You can see there's some really big, really credible companies there, totally on board, totally on this journey now, and doing it for themselves. And it's become, as well as more mature, much more competitive place. And that sets us some new challenges. And actually, the next big arena, the next big battle in that challenge for us as a company in the UK is with a project called Hornsea 3. And I'll just hand over to Sophie to talk to you a bit about that.
Thank you, Duncan. Good evening, everyone. As Nigel mentioned, I am an ex-Imperialer myself, and I'm very happy to be back to talk to you today about our company and the journey we're on our green transition. So you can see from Duncan's presentation that as a company, we have taken pretty bold leaps to transform the way that we do business to align with our green strategy. But this very much is just the start of the journey. That boldness and the momentum that we have harnessed over the last few years, we need to take that and drive it even further if we're to reach Ørsted's ambitious renewable targets, and also to meet the UK's targets as well. And Hornsea 3 project, I'm pleased to say, is set to be a major contributor on the path to meeting both of those targets. So let me tell you a little bit more about our project. Hornsea 3 is Ørsted's next planned offshore wind farm we're developing off the east coast of the UK, and it can generate around 2.4 gigawatts of clean energy. That's enough to power over 2 million homes. As you have seen from our previous slide, Ørsted has a strong track record of developing and building offshore wind projects in the UK. And that's particularly true for the area off the east coast, which we call the Hornsea zone. The zone is split up into a number of projects. Firstly, Hornsea 1. This project completed construction at the end of 2019 and is equipped with 174 wind turbines, each rated at 7 megawatts. At 1.2 gigawatts in total, it's the world's largest offshore wind farm, and it was the first to have more than 1 gigawatts of capacity. The second project in the zone, somewhat imaginatively named Hornsea 2, is currently under construction, and when commissioned in 2022, it will be even bigger than its predecessor at almost 1.4 gigawatts in capacity and utilising upgraded 8 megawatt turbines. So at the time of their construction, both Hornsea 1 and Hornsea 2 have been at the forefront of technological and construction capabilities for the industry. With Hornsea 3, we'll be pushing that envelope even further. The project is located on the east of the Hornsea zone, with a site area of almost 700 square kilometres. So just to put that into perspective, that's nearly half the size of Greater London. It will house up to 231 turbines, and the top of the blades will reach around 300 metres. That's equivalent to the height of the Shard. So the scale of these new projects is really just immense. The cable that will transport the energy from the wind farm site will be over 200 kilometres long, making landfall near Cromer, where it will then transport the energy to the Norwich Main National Grid substation. From this point, it will then be distributed to power our homes and industries across the country. So developing an asset we're talking about here, it takes a considerable amount of time and effort before we can even start thinking about construction or the turbine spinning. The Hornsea 3 project started life way back in 2009 when Smart Wind Limited, which was a joint venture between Mainstream Renewable Power and Siemens Project Ventures, were originally awarded the zone in the Crown Estate Round 3 bid process. Then in August 2015, Ørsted acquired the rights from Smart Wind Limited to develop the Hornsea zone exclusively. In September 2016, we commenced extensive consultation with stakeholders, statutory bodies, and the local communities as part of the public consultation for the project. And we eventually submitted an application to the Secretary of State in June 2018 for a development consent order. And so this is essentially the permission from the UK government for the development to proceed and for us to be able to build out the project within a defined set of agreed limits and conditions. And there are a number of steps in the assessment of that application, and that brings us to where we are today, where we are expecting the determination on the consent on the 31st of December. So we are definitely hoping for a good New Year's Eve celebration this year, I would say. Once we have that milestone under our belt, we can then start looking to the next phase of the project life, which will be preparing for construction and eventually the start of operations around the mid to late 20s. So from inception to the point where Hornsea 3 starts producing the megawatt hours that are so critical to the energy transition will be more than 15 years. Even on a best case development timeline, you're looking at around a decade from the start of development to the commercial operations of a wind farm in the UK. And that's why it's so important that we have the regulatory framework in place to provide the visibility and uncertainty for the development investment. Of course, whilst this whole development timeline is happening, the industry isn't just standing still. We have been continually pushing the boundaries and gaining experience, meaning that the cost of offshore wind has decreased drastically in the time frame that Hornsea 3 has been under development. And this cost reduction is down to a number of elements. Firstly, scale. A decade ago, the industry was building projects that were almost completely bespoke in nature, from one end of the value chain to the other. Today, we're at a point where the individual projects have reached a size where they can benefit from economies of scale themselves. But more than that, the industry is providing a pipeline of projects that gives transparency and predictability to allow the supply chain to achieve economies of scale across projects and even across markets. Second to that, we have our maturing industry and technology innovation. So innovation of offshore wind turbines is a key one, and which is often mentioned, but also new installation equipment methods, continuous improvements of foundation design, improved cables with higher capacity, and a growing supply chain all support a declining cost journey. As we build more and more of these wind farms, they naturally form geographical clusters which benefit from synergies. For example, the operation and maintenance on our Hornsea 1 and 2 wind farms will be conducted from Ørsted's O&M hub in Grimsby, which also serves other Ørsted offshore wind farms on the UK East Coast. This allows us to benefit from combined facilities, harbour areas and vessels, and the expertise of our people. But at the same time, it also creates an industry of scale within that hub that can transform local communities. And finally, an area we've touched on before, but one that I think is arguably the single largest factor in driving down costs, is the management and perception of risk. Yes, it's true that projects today are far more complex and technically challenging than they were a decade ago. But with each new project, we become more experienced, more knowledgeable, and more comfortable in how we manage those residual risks. From a developer perspective, this means that we don't have to include the contingencies that we may have done once upon a time when we're budgeting the capital expenditure that's needed to build out these projects. On the funding side, investors and financiers don't demand such high risk premiums. This means that the cost of borrowing the money to build out the projects, so our cost of capital, is much cheaper than it was years ago. So before I hand back to Duncan, I just wanted to give an example of a real life example of how innovation and collaboration can really make a difference to the people in the industry and also supporting the cost reduction journey. So what you're seeing here on this slide is an image of what we call our Get Up Safe system. And this is something we have developed in partnership with Scotland-based PICT Offshore. So Get Up Safe is a motion compensated hoist solution that enables our wind farm technicians to transfer between the crew transfer vessels and offshore wind turbines without turbine boat landing and ladders. Using this technology means that technicians no longer have to step from a moving boat onto a ladder and then climb to reach the base of the turbine. Instead, now they can simply clip onto the system and be hoisted up to the turbine base directly from the boat. This means in periods of high and varying wave heights, there's no danger of collision between a technician and boat. So you can clearly see that there are big health and safety benefits to something like this. It also means that technicians can make that transfer much quicker than before. In addition to increasing the health and safety and efficiency of the transfer, the technology also removes the need for external access ladders, meaning that the amount of steel required in the structure is reduced, providing further potential for cost reduction. So we're now in a place where it is cheaper to build out offshore wind farms than it is to develop new coal or gas-fired power plants. This is a major breakthrough for the green transformation. The renewable energy technologies that we need to fundamentally transform the energy systems and radically reduce emissions are at our disposal, and they are cost efficient. With that, I'll hand back to you, Duncan.
Thank you, Sophie. I love that example of the Get Up Safe system. It's also a real example of a small company with expertise in people working at height and product development, working with a big company that's got a problem to solve, getting people safely and reliably on and off moving vessels. And the technical solution involves lasers that are a part on the structure and are tracking the moving boat deck and making sure that the cable follows the moving boat deck exactly. So, it's a wonderful combination of technical, commercial, small company, big company. A brief five minutes or so now, I think, just trying to answer this question. Well, okay, if that's the kind of project which is going to make a tangible difference here, we've seen recently the UK government committing to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And we're somewhere in the scenario of 80 to 130 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. That is a total transformation from where we are today. And I think we need to answer the question, you know, what does that look like? And I think that question starts by a quick look at where they are today. So this shows you in green. You don't need to read all the details here, but you can see the link. If anyone's interested in the details, you can just follow that link. This is taken from a report by the Crown Estate. That's the body which manages the renewable energy rights, not only in our territorial waters out to 12 nautical miles, but also out to the edge of the renewable energy zone that is the UK's. The green ones there are the projects that have been developed over the last 19 years in UK waters and are operating, and that's roughly 10 gigawatts. And it's, you know, 2 or 3 dozen different installations. And then in yellow, you can see the projects which, at least at January this year, were under construction. So that's another 4.5 gigawatts under construction at the moment. And then in red, you can see another tranche of projects which at January this year were not quite into construction yet, but they had been awarded a government contract to take the offtake, the electricity produced, and to give them a price for that electricity. So well on the way towards construction. And that's another 5.5 gigawatts. So that, it kind of gets across, I hope, you know, partly the fact that we started and the green ones are typically close to shore, and the red ones are much bigger and further from shore, but also it's quite a long journey. That pathway of project development is maybe, as Sophie showed for Hornsea 3, it can be a 10 or 12 year journey, can be even longer. I think for Triton Knoll, which is currently in construction, I think that the seabed for that project was exclusively awarded to RWE in 2004 or 5. So that's really a very long journey that these projects sometimes go through. Even if construction can be done in 2 or 3 years, the overall project development is quite long. And so what that means is we can see here the first 20 gigawatts of UK's offshore wind power capacity, and all of that is expected to be operational by the middle of this decade. You know, and the pieces of that puzzle are in play already. The planning consent is there, the grid connections are there, so National Grid is ready to connect, allow those to connect into the national grid, and the government has supported them with a contract which gives them line of sight to what they're going to sell their product for. So that's the first 20 gigawatts. If we go on to the next page, you can see here how that fits in. So those bottom 2 bars are those two, is that 20 gigawatts, the stuff that's already operating and the stuff that's committed. And on top of that, there's another 15 gigawatts where exclusive rights to a piece of seabed have been granted by the Crown Estate to some developers, and there are projects that are envisaged. They're probably in different stages of applying for planning consent. Some of them have now got planning consent and are waiting for the next auction round, where those projects will fight to win an offtake contract, and that's a competitive process based on price, and it's through that competitive process that the government ensures that the UK consumer is getting a good deal for this clean electricity. And you can see there's about 15 gigawatts of projects. So if all of those came to fruition, and we have to say, if we look back at history, there is an attrition rate. Some projects don't make it. They either don't make it because something is discovered during the course of development. The site may not be suitable. For example, the geology is sometimes extremely challenging, and that either just means it's not doable, or more typically it's just very expensive, and so that site couldn't compete. And sometimes there are environmental reasons why a project doesn't get its planning consent. You know, that can sometimes be because of visual impacts. It can sometimes be because of environmental impacts. But subject to attrition rates, there's another 15 gigawatts, and that could get us to 35 gigawatts. So the government's 2030 target already requires us to bring some more projects into that early stage of development. And the good news is the Crown Estate has already organised its next major leasing round of seabed, and there'll be a new leasing round that will lease somewhere between 7 and 8.5 gigawatts of seabed, and that should take place in January, and that will refill this pipeline of sites under development. And then you can see that that should give us enough to reach the 40 gigawatt target. But bear in mind that by 2050, we envisage at least twice that, and maybe 3 or more times that amount. So there is going to need to be a continuing rolling process of leasing seabed, developing those sites, and that process is going to get much more complex. You know, we're going to be, you know, you might think of the sea as a sort of a barren open place where you're free to put offshore wind farms, but it's actually a really busy place with shipping and cables, telecoms cables, aggregates extraction, oil and gas production. The list goes on. There are many users, and they've all of those interests have got to be balanced. If we go on to the next page, you know, the government recently declared its vision, if you like, for how this journey is going to go. Number one on the 10-point plan was the 40 gigawatt commitment for offshore wind, making offshore wind the backbone of our electricity system. But also you can see there with point 2, which is producing low carbon hydrogen as an energy vector in our economy. But also, if you can see there, point 4, shift to zero emission vehicles, and that effectively means electric vehicles right now. And the legislation is proposed to make petrol and diesel vehicles, they won't be sold in this country from 2030. And then also I would point to greener buildings, point 7. You know, some real hard targets for replacing where we currently are a nation that has our central heating fired by gas boilers, to shift that with a significant proportion of our homes that will be heated by heat pumps, air source heat pumps. So a very major change, not only in how clean the electricity we use for what we use it for today is, but also electrifying quite a lot of things which we don't use electricity for today. So we need to do both, and the volume that we need to increase in terms of renewable production needs to both replace the non-clean power that we produce today, but also produce enough for these new applications. And maybe we can come back in the discussion to talk a bit more about hydrogen and the other things there. But I should probably wrap up here. So you paint that vision, 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, maybe a similar amount of onshore renewables as well. That's an enormous producing capacity from renewables. It's a very different character of power production and energy production than we're used to. It's a very different mix. It means organizing our electricity system, organizing our electricity markets in a different way. It definitely feels to me to be an achievable target. We can do this. We're going to need to mobilize for it, to apply ourselves with a sense of urgency and to take action and do it. That needs policy from governments. It needs assistance from all sorts of organisations, everything from the Crown Estate to the bodies which advise us when we're seeking environmental permits. And it also is going to require some changes in society. You know, if we are going to change the way we heat our homes, that means changing the infrastructure inside your own home. And we are notoriously resistant to doing that kind of thing. So it also needs a switching on the consumer end as well. In order to electrify energy uses which today are not met by electricity, we're going to need hydrogen production, renewable hydrogen production, using electricity to split water through electrolysis. And also we're going to need to clean up our existing carbon intensive industries that are precious to us in the way we live our lives. They produce the products and allow us to live comfortably as we do, but we can't afford to continue with the pollution that they cause. So carbon capture and storage can be a bridging solution for that. So we're moving from energy sources which are dispatchable, which have a high variable cost, towards electricity sources which have a high capital cost, typically renewables, but an extremely low operating cost. So it doesn't cost you much to produce an extra unit. once you've built it, but it's a high investment up front. It's a great time to be making high investments because the interest rates are really low. So governments all around the world are making heavy investments in infrastructure. But that is a new world, and National Grid's future energy scenarios, anyone who is fascinated by this, you can get a great overview of it by digging into some of their scenarios at that link below. I've probably spoken way too long, so let's maybe just finish up with the last little video.
Imagine you were asked to change the way we power the world. It might seem a bit overwhelming at first, until you remember, even the biggest changes happen one small step at a time. One gear, one bolt, one circuit at a time. One click, one test, one advancement at a time. One machine, one better machine. One bigger, better machine at a time. One person, one team, one small step at a time. From the world's first offshore wind farm to its biggest, we've been working to create a world that runs entirely on green energy. Because little by little, big happens. Ørsted, love your home.
Thank you. I think that's it from me.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed. It's my great pleasure to say a very short vote of thanks at the end of that, Duncan and Sophie. And it's a very simple thing to say, because actually I think that's a really great insight and a really compelling, not just vision, but actual delivery of how we transition to a low carbon energy system. I was struck by a number of the things you said, but perhaps just to highlight one, the transition of your company from an oil and gas company into a renewables company. Clearly, at the forefront of thinking about that is has increased your return on capital from 6% to 10.6%, and that must be the most compelling thing that your shareholders care about and that your investors care about. So absolutely fascinating to see that, and a great story for others. I think secondly, I take from it as an engineer the sheer scale of the technology you're dealing with, the height of the shard, Sophie said, for some of these new turbines. So absolutely compelling engineering scale. Clearly aware of the time it takes to take projects to market, and that's something perhaps you might want to touch on in the Q&A, because if we're going to transition to a 2050 net zero economy, we're going to need to really accelerate, aren't we, in how quickly we can move these projects along, not just in the UK, but globally. I was struck at I guess what I take from the need for an integrated solution. This isn't only about putting wind turbines in place or other renewable generators in place. It's about the integration of the outputs of that generation into the energy system, whether it's through the electrical supply system or turning it into another energy carrier like hydrogen, and many different companies and organizations coming together to help deliver that. And then finally, perhaps I was struck that, when you work with the oil and gas industry and your heritage comes from that, there's a very clear focus on safety culture. And it was great to see that focus on safety culture carried across to your new industry of offshore wind. And I thought the example you gave of that innovation for carrying your technical, your engineering staff, your maintenance staff up to the top of these very tall wind turbines, which are obviously, is quite a hazardous step, was really compelling. So thank you for sharing that with us. So thank you indeed, Duncan and Sophie, for your time. I know we're looking forward to some discussion now. I look forward to that as well, but thanks again on behalf of everyone here. We would normally give you a round of applause at this point. Hard to do that in a virtual format, but thanks very much indeed. So I'll pass back to you, Anna.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you, Duncan and Sophie. We will now take a very short break for 5 minutes, and we will be back at 17:57 to continue with our discussion and benefit from our guests' experience and knowledge, as well as our colleagues from around the college in the working in the wind energy area. Look forward to seeing you in a few minutes again. Welcome back, everyone. For our panel discussion, in addition to our guests from Ørsted, we also wish to welcome 3 leading wind energy experts from Imperial College. Professor Lydia Zdravkovic, Professor of Computational Geomechanics at our Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Professor Rafael Palacios, Professor of Computational Aeroelasticity at our Department of Aeronautics, where he leads the Load Control and Aeroelastics Lab. And finally, my co-director at the Energy Futures Lab, Professor Tim Green, Professor of Electrical Power Engineering at the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering. Following up the discussion, I will like to turn to Lydia first. And if I may ask Lydia, through your experience researching foundation systems for offshore wind turbine, how has geotechnical engineering affected wind power development, and where do you think there are important opportunities for geotechnics to facilitate wind energy production?
Sorry, Lydia, if you could just unmute.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Yes, over the past 5-6 years within the geotechnics group at Imperial College, we have spent significant effort in trying to make the foundation design for wind turbine monopile foundations more efficient, and we have succeeded this through a leadership from Ørsted and from other industry partners, as well as Carbon Trust, with a couple of projects, PISA and currently Alpaca projects, that have gone to details of site-specific characterization of different seabed conditions, in particular around the UK, and enabled that level of precision and field testing and numerical modeling to develop a new design methods, definitely more efficient design methods for offshore monopiles that have reduced that installation cost of foundations as a first step into trying to optimize the wind farm and cost in general. Now, where the challenges are, as Duncan said in his lecture, yes, sometimes you can't go to the site because of the geology, but that is perhaps where the further research in terms of, and again, close industry related research should go into those challenging soils and trying to understand them and try to work out with the design methods that can essentially enable those sites to be used. And that is an obvious further step forward. And at the moment we are working with some of those challenging soils, like soft fractured rocks and very structured rocks that some of the wind farms are already being constructed in.
Thank you, Lydia. Can I also ask then, there was a question from our audience. Tim Young asked, why do we need to decommission wind farms? Why not replace the turbines when they become obsolete? I thought you might have a comment on this in relation to how foundations work.
Yeah, I guess probably one of the first reasons for not reusing the existing foundations and existing structure is that these structures are becoming taller with time, so the blades are longer. So the existing foundations may not have sufficient factor of safety or to sustain those larger loads. I think that would probably be the first reason. But then I think if it is just a matter of changing the turbines to the same sort of size turbine, then I think there is still a lot of work that can be done for both structural and soil resilience to improve for something like that to be able to take place, because we know that with time soil does tend to change its properties. Structure maybe not so much, but that resilience part is something that deserves further investigation.
Thank you very much, Lydia. If Duncan allows me to follow up with a discussion on his side from an industry perspective, how much change are you seeing in practice, and are there notable differences that you see in the uptake of the different technological options, for example, for foundations development in different parts of the world? And is the UK special in any way?
So the answer is, yeah, there are differences. I mean, most of the turbines that have been put up in the world have been done on monopiles, essentially a tube. We've sort of got up to 8 or 9 meters diameter maximum so far, but we've also had a number of wind farms that have used jacket foundations, either piled jackets or suction bucket jackets. And there's also been a small number where the foundation has essentially been a gravity-based design. So there are a range of designs that have been used, even though the majority have been based on monopiles. And the jacket foundations have particularly been used where the waters have been deeper, where the turbines have been heavier, or a characteristic of the loads that they're being subjected to means that the jacket's less sensitive to that, but also earthquake sensitive zones as well. And I think it's easier to see your way through the engineering with that design approach and engineering approach. So it is a little bit of horses for courses, but all of the different designs have got their opportunities. As Lydia was saying, you know, during the course of development, we use geophysical and geotechnical studies to create a general model. We use location specific studies to understand every location, and we kind of bespoke design each foundation, particularly with monopiles. Each one is bespoke designed for that position, that set of weather and wave conditions, and that particular turbine model with its resonances and its load characteristics and its design life. And we will extend the life of turbines by replacing components wherever we can, or just keeping the assets going. That's what's happened traditionally. That's what happened with our coal stations. You know, we traditionally operate these things way beyond their original design lives. So the equivalent in wind power is, you know, repairing or maybe sometimes replacing components like blades, gearboxes, shafts. You can do all of that. You can also really monitor and track and measure your foundations, comparing them in service with the design assumptions you made up front, you know, and are they behaving exactly as you did, and is there anything you can do to extend their life? It might be enhanced corrosion protection, it might be something mechanical, you know, but definitely there's life extension, and there are many different foundation approaches. I wanted maybe just to mention the suction bucket ones. it's a wonderful concept to, typically build an upturned bucket, although a really large one. It might be 10 or 12 meters in diameter, and lower it to the seabed, and you've got various different feet of your foundation jacket, and then by evacuating the inside of each of those buckets, it sucks itself into the seabed and gives you that anchor and that fixing to the seabed. So it's a smart technique where the soil conditions are fit for it.
Wonderful, thank you. And if you allow me to pick on the operations and maintenance point that you made just now, and there was a question that we had from Lawrence Farney in the chat. He picked up that with a greater distance offshore, for example, for the Hornsea wind farms, have you had to use innovative operations and maintenance techniques, having to travel so far offshore with your maintenance crew? And I was going to add to that, can you tell us roughly how substantial is the maintenance cost in comparison to the build-up cost of a wind farm throughout its lifetime? Do you have a sense that you can give us?
Yeah, I can do all that. If we start with the innovation, and I think the early offshore wind farms were close to shore, and typical operations and maintenance strategies involved technicians, shore-based technicians, traveling out to the wind farm each day. You have to be very careful monitoring the weather and the wave conditions so that you can get access safely to the structures. And in the early days, offshore turbines typically needed 2 visits a year for scheduled maintenance, and then you've got maybe unscheduled visits as well. So you can do the sums and work out, it's quite a lot of transfer vessels ferrying back and forth and doing so throughout the year, even though you try and get the service, the scheduled services during the summer months when production is low and access is easier. With the newer wind farms far from shore, you've got 6 or 7 hours transit. It doesn't work to do that on a daily basis. So we borrow with pride from the oil and gas industry. And the way we're operating Hornsea 1 is with what we call an SOV, a special operations vessel. And on that vessel, the technicians live and work, and they do 2-week shifts. It's a 24/7 operation when we need it to be. And the technicians are dropped off at the turbines. That vessel is a bigger, more substantial vessel. It's a great life if you like that sort of thing. Comfortable cabins, great food, work colleagues to live and work with for that intense 2-week period. And you're dropped off at the turbines, typically using motion compensated gangways. So none of that climbing up the ladders and transferring from a small vessel. It's much more, walking on an automatically compensated gangway onto the turbine. So that's one of the ways we do it. We also use a lot more of helicopters than we would near shore. So, if you have an urgent situation or a very specialist bit of expertise that you need to be out on a turbine, it's actually relatively quick to get technicians into a helicopter, and they can be lowered onto the top of the nacelle and winched down, and they're there immediately. And it may not be instinctive, but actually the weather windows that you can transfer people using a helicopter are actually larger than the weather windows that you can transfer using the vessel.
Oh, wonderful.
Even though it's winching down. So these days, turbines don't need 2 visits a year, maybe 1 visit a year for scheduled maintenance, and also we're seeing that the products are much better this year. I mean, these days, these are bespoke developed offshore products. They've benefited. It's a much more mature industry, and the quality is better. The design history is stronger, so the performance is also better in terms of how often does something go wrong and the turbine have to turn off. And they're also massively more instrumented now. So there's an enormous amount of data. On Hornsea 1, there are 30,000 internet locations on that wind farm asset. So it's an enormous amount of data here. There's an enormous amount that you can look at, and the real art is working out what to look at and how to use that data to get the performance up. How do you spot if a turbine is maybe off color for some reason, and what's making it not perform as well as the ones around it? How do you spot it? What do you do? And when do you intervene? So that's really about using the big data. And I think you asked a question about what proportion of the cost of energy is to do with that lifetime cost. And you can do that some in different ways, but I think if you read standard industry publications, it's typically between 10 to 20 pounds per megawatt hour from the through life costs. So on a new wind farm, that might be a quarter or a third of the overall cost, and maybe less. I mean, it used to be a fifth, and it may well be a fifth going forward as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Duncan. And this is a very good point for me to bring my colleague, Professor Rafa Palacios, whose expertise on the computational methods and dynamic analysis will help us to understand better how are these tools used in wind turbines management and in engineering, in the design of wind farms. Rafa, are you able to tell us what control and optimization can do, and what are the challenges we are still facing today?
Goodness, can you hear me right? Yes. Yes, there's a lot to be done. It's a very difficult problem, as you would expect. I think we got the image today of how big these devices are, and this is not something you just build and see how it works. So you need to do a humongous amount of testing on computer models, on learning about the physics of the process at all levels of the design cycle. So I was noting on Sophie's presentation, she mentioned on Hornsea 1 they use 7 megawatt wind turbines. On Hornsea 2 they use 8 megawatt wind turbines. Hornsea 3, she didn't mention the number, but she put the total amount and number of turbines divided one by the other, and I got at least 10. And I guess capacity factor is probably a bit higher, so probably 12 megawatt wind turbines. These are monsters, right, in terms of the dimension. And it's not the shard, it's the shard moving, okay? So when we start looking into dimensions, it's a discussion I've been having for a long time, which is how big a wind turbine can become. And nobody really knows. Every time someone puts a ceiling, someone breaks it. And the engineering ingenuity that comes alongside this is massive, because wind turbines is just not, they don't scale. So I heard somewhere they talk about the square cube law. The power goes as the square, so the square of the size, but the weight goes as the volume, goes as the cube. So the amount of weight that a wind turbine has as you increase the power actually it becomes heavier. The amount of tons per megawatt becomes higher in terms of scaling. The implication of this is that as you go into even higher or larger wind turbines, then we need to be even more creative on where we can squeeze efficiencies on these designs. And this is where modeling and simulation, which is where I enter, plays a critical role. A second aspect, which is very closely related to this, is the aerodynamic environment in which these things operate. I'm by training, I'm an aerospace engineer, so I'm okay with aerodynamics of any color. Aerodynamics of wind turbines are the hardest, okay, because they are in the wrong place. You'd rather have them flying up, and then everything is nice and clear. You don't have turbulence, you don't have atmospheric boundary layers, you don't have all this mess. Of course, they are in the right place for getting wind out, but that means the mathematical modeling of that environment becomes extremely challenging. And Ørsted had a good example last year when they were claiming openly that the models weren't good enough and they weren't predicting the capacity that the farms would have. This is where we enter in terms of new methods based on first principles that actually build knowledge of how these wind farms can produce. And Ørsted in particular has been very good at this because they are also supplying data to researchers to compare with one model. So there is a database which is accessible to researchers, and it's the sort of techniques we need. The only real experiments that really work here are associated to the wind farms in live. And those are the ones now we need to retrofit with computer models in terms of see how we can do predictions of those events.
And how about digital twinning on physical assets? Is this something that you do?
It goes naturally on top of this thing. As soon as start building computer models, start building the knowledge of reality through simulation, then opens the door to basically having this parallel, it's literally a parallel universe, in which what we build is a representation of the physical assets on computer models. And they can be particularized to conditions, to blades. This is something which Ørsted, they were talking about before as well, how they can integrate big data and their analysis. And the challenge there is of course, to make those digital twins, this parallel evolution of the real asset, to be representative, to have the right characteristics. So we can do not only retrospective analysis, but also prediction. We can project to the future. And that at that point, you enter the operational aspects of how the control of the wind turbine, the operation of the wind turbine can benefit from all this knowledge. So a lot of things to say. I don't want to
Thank you.
But there is, of course, a lot of activity on parallel to the wind farm, which is the engineers that try to squeeze power and reduce costs associated to this.
Thank you very much, Rafa. And I think that I'm going to invite my co-director, Professor Tim Green, to come in and comment and tell us how we can really transition to a low-carbon electricity supply network with a substantially higher renewable electricity element. And pick on the question that Paul put on the chat. He asked about the security of supply, intermittency, and grid stability, topics on which Tim can very much enlighten us. Tim.
Sure, I'll do my best. And I think Duncan remarked at the end that the very large volumes of renewables are changing the system. And I saw several questions that asked, do we need to build new nuclear if we have this much wind? Do we need to build lots of storage? And the story at the moment is around how natural gas partners wind, because we have times when solar and wind is more than 50% of our electricity, and then if you add in the nuclear, gas gets squeezed down to 10%. And then sometimes it's the other way around. The wind is down at 10% and the gas has to be up at 50%. So all the counterparty within the system, as it were, to the wind is the gas. And that's what we've got to stop, because we can't burn that volume of unabated natural gas. So what do we do instead? And nuclear is not a great partner for wind, at least not the way nuclear is built in the UK. It's not flexible enough. So when the wind speed drops, you can't turn the nuclear up. So what are we going to do? So storage is clearly part of that. We can build large volumes of batteries, and they get you through some of the short-term problems. So batteries were a really good solution for, stepping in at short notice if there's a failure in one of the generators in the system. So that element of security supply, batteries are great for. They're not quite so good for long periods of low wind speed. So it's not so much that there's periods of no wind, but there's certainly 3 or 4 days sometimes with wind at 10% or so of its capacity. And the indications there are that UK probably needs about 20 terawatt hours of something, of energy that can come in, long-term storage or fuel, but clearly it's got to be zero carbon fuel. And I think that link back to things Duncan said and about the partnering with hydrogen and electrolysis. So electrolyzing when renewables are plentiful and relatively low cost to produce a fuel for other parts of the economy, but also a fuel you can store that you bring back into electricity when you have long periods of lowish wind speed. Some of the modelling we've done suggests that yes, we're going to need numbers at least as big as what Duncan said, 80 to 100 gigawatt of wind. But we need to partner that with probably similar scale of storage. But there are other things we could do. We look to much more flexibility in the way electric vehicles are charged, so tariffs that encourage the car to automatically charge when prices are low, but also to trade, to export when we wind to our neighbours in Belgium and Germany and elsewhere when we have an excess, but import when we have a deficit. Those are some of the ways. The more we do that flexibility in demand, in trading, in storage, the more we can capture the low prices that wind offers us and not have to do high price things like burn fuel.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tim. And you have also addressed a question that Sean Talford and Marine Briggs have put up on the chat for us. And just for a moment now, I would like to put our guests again in the spotlight, if Duncan permits me to use my privilege. And of course, he mentioned about hydrogen, and we know that Ørsted is a partner in the GigaStack facility development and the piloting. I wanted to hear a little bit more about how this partnership came about and what may be happening in the real term and the longer term, and if it looks like a project that he believes will fly.
Yeah, let me do that. So the GigaStack project is a partnership between three companies mainly. Now, one of them is a company called ITM Power, which is a UK-based manufacturer of
it's the PEM electrolyzer, isn't it?
Sorry, ITM Power is a manufacturer of electrolysis stacks and a hydrogen producer. They've come together with Ørsted as a renewable energy provider, and also a company called P66, which owns and operates a long-established refinery. This particular one is on the Humber, and the idea there is that we're currently in a phase of doing a front-end engineering design study to try and understand what a plant would look like that took electricity from one of our offshore wind farms, used that in ITM's electrolyzers to produce renewable hydrogen, and then used that renewable hydrogen to substitute for a portion of what the current fossil produced hydrogen is that is used at that refinery at the moment, and therefore bit by bit to reduce the carbon impact of that refinery, and to in that way pioneer the technical and commercial and engineering solutions that would be needed to actually shift our industries and our refineries more widely to a different model. You've got to try it out. And so it started with a concept study. That was phase one. We're now in phase two, which is this feed. If the feed goes well, if we can identify those technical requirements, if we can scope out that engineering concept, if we can make it all work, and if we can then define what the market mechanisms that actually might make that project move to the next stage would be. Mm-hmm. Because like many new technologies and new products, they need a bit of a help, because the people investing in the first of a kind need to be able to see that investment is going to be worthwhile. So, typically what they find is, you're going to need some sort of visible structure that might come in the form of some grants to help you with the capital costs, and it might come with some form of assurance that there'll be a market for the clean hydrogen that you produce. Mm. And that's the phase we're in at the moment, trying to put together the technical concept, trying to think through what the practical engineering and commercial challenges would be, and trying to work with the government, with regulators, to define, well, how could you put in a support framework which actually made that project come to fruition. What we'd really love is to be able to bring it together, maybe with a 20 or 100 megawatt first installation, and then use that to substitute a measurable proportion of the hydrogen that the P66 site is currently using, and produce that in a clean way instead.
Wonderful.
And of course, if we can do that, then we can mature this, work out how to scale it to the next level, and really you can start thinking incredibly broadly then. If you can start substituting fossil produced hydrogen with green hydrogen, then you could see a vision where you start creating clusters where you're doing that at a scale, and some of the hydrogen could be used to inject into our gas grid, and therefore step by step decarbonize our central heating infrastructure as it is today. And some of it could be used for maybe heavy transit, for the kind of vehicles which are not so easy to see the way through with battery powers. So not so much the light transport, but the heavy transport. You know, maybe that could be a green hydrogen fueled fuel cell driven trucks or trains, or even using that green hydrogen as a starter feedstock for other molecules that could be used in everything from shipping to planes or whatever. So that's the vision. It may well take us to 2050 to get there. We have to be realistic about the infrastructure, the journey of maturation that you have to go on, the amount of investment, and the lessons that the engineers need to learn and feed back in as the product and the plant evolve.
Wonderful. Thank you, Duncan. And I am going to skip over the bit that is on the business models development, which I know that you are hectically working on for the 4 different options that you are considering. And I will invite my colleague, Professor Nigel Brandon, to also pick on a question that actually came from the audience from Robin White. Of course, we know about the PEM electrolyzers, which are advantageous in comparison to the alkaline electrolyzers, but of course we also have the PGM availability requirements. So can Nigel give us a few ideas about how hydrogen, the green hydrogen supply, fits in the picture, and how wind can be coupled with it effectively in his view?
Anna, thanks. I mean, Duncan's just set out a vision there, which I wouldn't disagree with at all. I think that there's a lot of interest in green electrolysis, green hydrogen from electrolysis at the moment, and clearly that only works if it's coupled with substantive renewable electricity. And the cost of green hydrogen, 70 to 80% of that cost is the cost of the renewable electricity that's going into it. So there's a very strong coupling between the availability of green hydrogen, whether that's as a transport fuel or for heating or for industrial decarbonisation, as Duncan's articulated, and the source of renewable electricity. I think the different electrolyzer technologies play in different ways into different areas, and alkaline electrolyzers have been with us since the 1920s, are scalable. You can buy a 100 megawatt electrolyzer and work very well, but they don't work very flexibly. And it's that combination of a more flexible electrolyzer, for example, a polymer electrolyzer, that alongside perhaps the more base-loaded electrolyzers, the alkaline electrolyzers that are being used, for example, in the big new project in Saudi Arabia with low carbon wind and solar to make green hydrogen and green ammonia. That's the way forward. But there's an absolutely strong coupling between the work that Ørsted and others are doing to drive down the cost of renewable electricity and the ability to use that electricity to decarbonize the energy system, whether it's through another energy carrier like hydrogen or not. So the very strong coupling between them. But the commitments from the EU and the commitments from a whole range of other national strategies around this are clear that this is going to be an area that grows and will be an important part of the energy system alongside all of the other things we've talked about. It's very much a partnership and a system as a whole. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nigel. And for the very last question, as we are getting to the close, I will turn to Sophie, if I may. As a young and also a woman, a young person and a woman, I would like to ask you, Sophie, can you tell us what do you think are important things that have helped you in your career, and what attracted you to an industry career, and what would you advise all these young people in the audience, and particularly the women studying or at an early career of their research?
Yeah, I would like to have thought that I'm not old enough or wise enough to give advice, but then when I realised when I was writing my bio for this event that next year it'll be a decade since I graduated, so I guess I should have something a little bit useful to say at least. I would say the biggest thing for me looking back that's been helpful in kind of defining my career is work experience. And I know it's probably quite an obvious one. And I remember as a student, you're told that all of the time that you need to prepare your applications for your job once you finish uni. You need to think about summer internships and spring internships. And before you know it, you should have been applying for jobs 3 years before you started university. And it's quite easy to get caught up in that application panic, as I sometimes like to refer to it. But I think even the smallest amount of work experience can give you something to differentiate yourself from others. It gives you something relatable to talk about in interviews, and also shows employers that you've had some exposure to the industry already. And with that exposure and knowledge, you know that you want to work for this company, you want this role. And I think that kind of self-insight is quite valuable as a graduate. Mm-hmm. And also with work experience as well, I think probably more valuable actually, it gives you a better understanding of the industry. The number of roles and opportunities is so diverse in the industry, as it is with any industry. And you really can't get an appreciation of that until you're actually working in it. So yeah, I knew I wanted to be commercial focused, but then you start working, you realize you could be in investments and working with business cases. You could be on the legal side, supporting divestments of projects. You could be on the consenting side. So there's just so many opportunities that you don't really realize until you get here.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So you're happy at Ørsted, and you're happy with the path so far. Thank you very much for your insights on behalf of the young people in the audience. And here I'm going to hand over to Professor Nigel Brandon to close the event for us. Nigel.
Yeah, Anna, thanks very much. And this will be very brief. I just want to thank everyone who's come along and listened to the lectures and the discussion this evening. We really appreciate your engagement in this very important issue. I'd like to thank my colleagues who are on the panel and have contributed their comments and time. But of course, in particular, I want to thank our speakers this evening. So Duncan, Sophie, thank you so much indeed for giving us your time, giving us your insights and giving us your inspiration. So thank you very much. And I think that brings us to a close. So good evening.